It is October 14th, 1943. Deep inside the hostile skies of Nazi Germany, the American 8th Air Force is being systematically annihilated. This is the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, a daring two-pronged assault on the industrial heart of the Third Reich. The target is vital: the ball-bearing factories that are critical to every single German tank, plane, and submarine. Destroy them, and you cripple the Nazi war machine. But the cost is proving to be catastrophic. The pride of the U.S. Army Air Forces, the B-17 bombers, are falling from the sky in flames. The German Luftwaffe has turned the sky into a slaughterhouse. The grim statistics from this single day paint a picture of a massacre that will forever be known as Black Thursday. 60 bombers shot down. Another 17 damaged so badly they will never fly again. Over 600 American airmen are killed, wounded, or captured, a casualty rate of over 20%. For the young men in those unpressurized, unheated aluminum tubes, the odds of survival were terrifyingly slim. Back in Washington, the mood is funereal. The entire daylight bombing campaign, America's central strategy for crippling the Nazi war machine from the air, is teetering on the brink of complete and utter collapse. The Luftwaffe's fighters are too fast, too numerous, and far too deadly. The American bombers, lumbering and vulnerable, are flying into a meat grinder from which few return. The problem is a simple, brutal equation of time and fuel. The bombers' fighter escorts, the rugged and powerful P-47 Thunderbolts, don't have the fuel to accompany the big friends all the way to distant targets like Schweinfurt and back. They are forced to turn back at the edge of German airspace, leaving the bombers to face the full, unmitigated fury of the German onslaught alone. The solution seems like a fantasy, a fighter that can fly farther than any other in history. But for the men of the 8th Air Force, impossible is not a word they are willing to accept. One of them, a maverick group commander with a reputation for insubordination, is about to propose a solution so audacious, so utterly insane, that it will change the course of the air war in Europe. What he didn't know was that his idea would not only be rejected, it would get him threatened with a court-martial and branded a fool. In the early days of World War II, the doctrine of strategic bombing was an article of faith for the U.S. Army Air Forces. This theory, championed by visionaries like the Italian general Giulio Douhet and the American firebrand Billy Mitchell in the 1920s and 30s, held that massive fleets of long-range bombers flying in tight, self-defending formations could penetrate deep into enemy territory and destroy the industrial heart of an enemy nation, making a bloody ground invasion unnecessary. They passionately believed the bomber, bristling with a dozen 50 caliber machine guns, would always get through. The prevailing wisdom at the Air Corps Tactical School, the intellectual center of the Air Force, was that the bomber was the queen of the battlefield. It was an offensive weapon, and everything else was secondary. The idea of a long-range escort fighter was seen as a defensive, almost cowardly concept. It ran counter to their entire philosophy. They were obsessed with the offensive power of the unescorted bomber. They were wrong, deadly wrong. The reality of combat over Europe was a brutal and swift lesson. The Luftwaffe's fighters, the agile Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the heavily armed Focke-Wulf FW-190, were lethal. German tacticians organized them into deadly Gefechtsverband formations, battle wings that would attack the bomber streams in waves. Some would engage the high-level escorts, while others would dive down, attacking the bombers from the front, a devastating tactic that targeted the weakly defended nose of the B-17. The losses were staggering and unsustainable. On some missions, the odds of a Crewmen completing his 25-mission tour of duty were less than 1 in 4. The 8th Air Force was bleeding to death over the skies of Germany. The Americans desperately tried to solve the problem. They developed new fighters, but none had the legs to go the distance. The P-39 Airacobra, supplied to the Soviets in large numbers, was underpowered at high altitudes where the bombers flew. The P-40 Warhawk, famous for its service with the Flying Tigers in China, was a decent dogfighter, but its range was pitifully short. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive, rugged, and powerful fighter, was the best they had. It could outdive anything the Germans flew, but it too was a short-range escort, a point defense fighter. The consensus among the aeronautical engineers and the top brass was that a long-range, high-performance fighter was a technical impossibility. The weight of the extra fuel would make it too slow and unmaneuverable to survive in the skies over Germany. The stakes could not have been higher. If a solution wasn't found, the entire daylight bombing campaign would have to be abandoned, and with it, the hope of ending the war without a bloody, prolonged ground invasion of Europe, a prospect that would cost millions of lives. Into this desperate crisis steps a man who, on paper, was the last person you'd expect to solve it. Colonel Don Blakesley was not an engineer. He had not graduated from West Point. He was a combat pilot, a natural-born leader with a rebellious streak a mile wide. Born in Fairport Harbor, Ohio, Blakesley had been hungry for combat from the very beginning. Before the United States even entered the war, he crossed the border into Canada and joined the Royal Canadian Air Force. He flew Spitfires with the famed Eagle Squadrons, American volunteers flying for the British, long before Pearl Harbor. He was a veteran's veteran. By late 1943, Blakesley was the commander of the 4th Fighter Group, the most successful and deadliest American fighter unit in Europe. He had seen the carnage firsthand. He had lost dozens of friends. He had listened to the bomber crews in the debriefing rooms, their faces etched with trauma, describing how they watched their friends burn. And he was utterly, unshakably convinced that the only way to win the air war was to provide fighter escort all the way to the target and back. He didn't have a new airplane. He didn't have a new engine. What he had was an idea, born not in a laboratory or a wind tunnel, but in the brutal crucible of combat. The moment of insight, the spark of genius, came to him during a mission debriefing. He was staring at a map, at the red lines that showed how far his P-47s could go, and the long, lonely, undefended path the bombers had to fly without them. He knew the P-47s had internal fuel tanks, but they also had hardpoints under their wings for carrying 500-pound bombs. What if, instead of bombs, they carried fuel? Extra fuel in external, disposable drop tanks. The idea was simple, almost insultingly so, but it was also revolutionary. It would turn his short-range interceptors into long-range killers. Blakesley knew his idea would be met with fierce resistance. The top brass in Washington and at 8th Air Force Headquarters was fixated on the P-51 Mustang, a promising new fighter that, while brilliant, was still months away from being available in large numbers. They didn't want to waste time and resources on modifying an existing plane they considered obsolete. So Blakesley did what he always did. He broke the rules. He gathered his most trusted maintenance chief, Sergeant John Pop Palishin, and set up a secret workshop, a skunk works in the truest sense of the term. With his small, hand-picked team, Blakesley began to experiment under the cloak of secrecy. They borrowed crude, unpressurized 75-gallon fuel tanks originally designed for the P-39 Airacobra and began the frustrating process of jury-rigging them to the wings of a P-47. The plumbing was a nightmare. They had to devise a way to feed the fuel from the external tank into the main tank, and critically, a way to jettison the heavy, empty tanks so the fighter could regain its agility for combat. The prototype was ugly, a Frankenstein's monster of a plane with tanks that looked like they were attached with duct tape and baling wire. But Blakesley didn't care about aesthetics. He cared about range. The first test flight was a nerve-wracking affair. No one knew if the makeshift tanks would even stay attached to the wings, let alone feed fuel to the massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine. As Blakesley roared down the runway, the ground crew held their breath. He climbed to altitude. An hour passed, then two. Far beyond the normal combat radius of the P-47. Then, a potential disaster. One of the fuel lines clogged. The engine sputtered. For a tense minute, Blakesley wrestled with the controls, switching tanks, trying to clear the line. Finally, the engine roared back to life. Then, to the astonishment of everyone watching from the ground, he returned. He had done it. "What in God's name do you think you're doing, Blakesley? I got a report you were modifying a combat aircraft without authorization from this command or right field. That is illegal. I could have you court-martialed for this." The reaction was predictable. The bureaucracy, which had utterly failed to solve the problem, was now trying to punish the man who had. Blakesley was grounded, his project shut down. The confrontation came to a head a few days later. Blakesley, defying his grounding order, had flown himself to the meeting. He was summoned to face the top brass of the 8th Air Force. The room was filled with generals, men who had built their entire careers on the pre-war doctrine of the self-defending bomber. They were not just skeptical, they were openly hostile, viewing Blakesley as a reckless, insubordinate cowboy. "Colonel, your proposal is not only reckless, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of air power. You want to turn our premier interceptor into a lumbering gas truck. It will be slow, unmaneuverable, a sitting duck for the 109s. We are in the business of bombing the enemy, not babysitting bombers with fighters that can't fight." Blakesley, a mere combat colonel, stood his ground. He wasn't an eloquent speaker, but he spoke with the raw, undeniable authority of a man who had seen combat up close. He laid out the grim statistics, the casualty rates, the failed missions. He spoke of the men he had lost, the friends he had seen burn. "With all due respect, General, your understanding of air power is getting our men killed by the hundreds every week. We are losing this war, and we are losing it because our bombers are being slaughtered. My men can fight. Give them the gas, and they will fight all the way to Berlin and back. All we need is the fuel." The room erupted. One general shouted that it was technically impossible. Another accused him of grandstanding. The senior general declared the idea a tactical absurdity. Blakesley's career was on the line, a court-martial a very real possibility. But then, a voice of quiet authority cut through the noise. It was Major General Ira Eaker, the commander of the 8th Air Force. Eaker was a thinking man's general, a maverick himself, a man who was not afraid to challenge conventional wisdom, and a man who had been deeply shaken by the losses at Schweinfurt. "Gentlemen, the colonel has the floor because our losses are unacceptable. If he says his men can do it, we have to let them try. Colonel Blakesley, you will get the tanks you need. Show us we're not wrong." The decision was made. Blakesley had won. He had his chance to prove that the impossible was possible. What happened next would not only change the course of the air war, but would also become a testament to the power of American ingenuity and the stubborn refusal to accept defeat. And if you're finding this story as incredible as we do, make sure to subscribe to Last Words and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the forgotten heroes and pivotal moments of history. With Eaker's blessing, What had been an illegal back alley modification went into mass production. The results were immediate and dramatic. On December 5, 1943, P-47s from the 56th Fighter Group, equipped with the new drop tanks, escorted bombers to Emden, Germany, a mission that was previously unescorted for the most dangerous portion of its flight. The results of these first few missions were staggering. The bomber loss rate, which had been as high as 20% on Black Thursday, plummeted to less than 5%. The little friends, as the bomber crews called them, were finally able to stay with the big friends. By early 1944, the tide had turned decisively, and the ultimate test was yet to come. Berlin, the Big B, the heart of the Reich. On March 6, 1944, the 8th Air Force launched its first major daylight raid on the German capital. Over 600 bombers took to the air, and with them, nearly 800 fighters, including Blakesley's 4th Fighter Group, their P-47s and new P-51s equipped with drop tanks. Blakesley himself led the mission. It was a brutal, sprawling dogfight that raged for hours over the skies of the German capital. As the American Armada crossed into German airspace, the Luftwaffe rose to meet them. German ground controllers vectored wave after wave of Bf-109s and FW-190s toward the bomber stream. But this time, it was different. Instead of finding unprotected bombers, they slammed into a wall of American fighters. We couldn't believe it. There were Thunderbolts and Mustangs over Berlin. It was a complete shock. For years, we were used to having a free hand with the Wehrmachts, 4-engine bombers. Now we had to fight our way through a swarm of angry wasps just to get a shot. They were everywhere. Blakesley was in the thick of it. He spots a flight of Bf-109s diving on a straggling B-17. He jettisons his empty drop tanks. The plane suddenly lighter, more nimble. He levels his P-47 and opens fire. His 8 50 caliber machine guns tear into the lead Messerschmitt, which explodes in a ball of fire. The other German fighters, stunned by the ferocity of the defense, break off their attack. The B-17 crew, watching from their gun positions, radio their thanks. One battle, one small victory in a sky filled with them. The kill ratios tell the story. In the months before the long-range escorts, the Luftwaffe was shooting down bombers at an alarming rate. After Blakesley's innovation, the tables were turned. The P-47s and P-51s, now able to stay with the bombers, began to systematically decimate the German fighter force. The kill ratio, which had been in the Luftwaffe's favor, swung dramatically to the Americans' side, reaching as high as 7-1. They were not just saving bombers, they were destroying the Luftwaffe. We called them our little friends, and there was no sweeter sight in the world than seeing them show up. You'd be hours into the mission, deep in Germany, scared to death, and then you'd see them, little specks, getting bigger. We knew we had a chance then. Before, it felt like a one-way trip for a lot of guys. Because of them, because of what Blakesley did, we came home. The numbers are a testament to the lives saved. Military historians estimate that the introduction of long-range fighter escorts, a direct result of Blakesley's insubordination and ingenuity, saved the lives of tens of thousands of American airmen. The daylight bombing campaign, once on the verge of failure, was now a decisive weapon, systematically destroying Germany's oil production, transportation network, and air force, paving the way for the D-Day invasion. The story of Don Blakesley and the long-range P-47 is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most brilliant war-winning solutions come from the most unexpected places. If you want to support our mission of bringing these vital stories of courage and innovation to light, consider joining our Patreon. You'll get exclusive content and behind-the-scenes access, and you'll be helping us honor the memory of these incredible individuals. After the war, When the analysts combed through the mountain of data, the conclusion was inescapable. General Karl Tui Spatz, the overall commander of U.S. strategic air forces in Europe, stated it plainly. Without the long-range fighter escort, the daylight bombing campaign would have been a failure. General Jimmy Doolittle, a legendary aviator in his own right, went further, calling the defeat of the Luftwaffe the most decisive factor in the Allied victory in Europe, a victory made possible by fighters that could go the distance. The legacy of Blakesley's innovation is still with us today, cornerstone of modern air power. The concept of extending the range of fighters to allow them to penetrate deep into enemy airspace is fundamental to military strategy. This principle directly influenced the design of fighters like the F-86 Sabre, whose ability to escort B-29s deep into MiG Alley during the Korean War was a direct descendant of Blakesley's idea. Every time you see a fighter jet being refueled in midair, you are seeing the direct technological and tactical evolution of Blakesley's jury-rigged drop tanks. And what of the man himself? Don Blakesley, the maverick who had defied the experts, risked his career, and changed the course of the war, remained a humble hero to the end of his days. He never sought the spotlight, never wrote a memoir, and rarely spoke of his wartime accomplishments. He was a fighter pilot, not a celebrity. When asked about his role in the development of the long-range escort, he would typically brush it off, saying, "I was just trying to save my guys and get the job done." After the war, he left the Air Force, went home, and lived a quiet life. The story of Don Blakesley is a powerful, timeless lesson. It's a reminder that courage is not just about facing the enemy in combat, but also about challenging the status quo, about having the moral fortitude to stand up for what you know is right, even when the entire world and all the experts are telling you that you're wrong. It is a testament to the profound truth that one person, armed with a simple, brilliant idea and an unbreakable will, can indeed change the world.